Hey everyone, welcome to Money and Macro Talks. My name is Joeri Schasfoort, and in this video I have a long conversation with Warren Mosler. Warren is an American economist and hedge fund manager, and he is known as the founding father of modern monetary theory, or MMT, an increasingly popular but controversial theory on money, currency, and unemployment. Now, there is a lot of confusion on what MMT actually is and what it implies for central banks, government, and monetary policy around the world. Therefore, I first asked him to clear up any confusion about the basics of MMT. After that, I asked him to take a look at some statements by famous non-MMT economists about MMT and tell me if these statements were correct or not. Finally, we discussed some of the deeper issues of MMT and how they apply to real-world examples such as current high inflation and Turkey's economy. But before going to the conversation, a big thank you to the Daily Upside for making this interview possible. The Daily Upside is a free email newsletter founded by a team of financial professionals with the goal of providing clarity and context on the world of business to already over 750,000 global thinkers. By now, it has become one of the first things I read in the morning, as it is analytical, insightful, and contextualizes the broader business trends to today's top stories. They deliver a morning brief followed by a more detailed analysis of 3 stories shaking up the financial landscape, such as why, despite challenging financial conditions, US consumers remain optimistic for now. Whether you are a financial professional or just looking to get a jump start on the news moving the markets, I can definitely recommend checking out the Daily Upside. It is totally free to sign up, and they send you one information-filled email every morning. Now, you can simply sign up by using the link in the description below. And with that being said, on to my conversation with Warren Mosler.
Hey, and Warren, so I did a little poll amongst the people watching this live, and also this might be of interest to you, but you seem to have actually a very enthusiastic fandom in the chat at the moment, commenting on how great you look on camera even. So this is definitely going quite far away from economics. But I also did a poll among them, and even though there are, it seems to be a lot of fans in there, I asked, okay, I can honestly say that I understand MMT. This was the question that I asked them. And 70% says no. So 30% says yes. I think this is still relatively high if you would ask it to any group of economists. And this is probably your fan base. But therefore, I thought, okay, let's start this conversation sort of a little bit with the basics. Because a lot of people, I know that you could basically just go to your website and read the white paper.
Sure.
And we're a lot of people just don't do that. So we're just going to help them with that a little bit, I figured.
Okay.
So
your vote is a little bit distorted because I voted yes on that poll.
You did as well. Oh, right. Yes.
So it's a little overstated there.
That's probably that 1%. You're finally part of that infamous 1% in the United States.
Right.
Anyhow, okay. So I figured. Look, I was reading this and I thought, okay, I am an economist, but I don't know too much about MMT. So one thing that I often came across is even people saying why is this a theory, right? What makes this a theory? And so then I went through it and I figured, hey, MMT, Warren's white paper has a lot to say about money. This is a story about money. It has a story about taxes. It has a story about unemployment. It has a story about inflation. And so I figured, this is a full theory of macroeconomics. So let's go through it. And why not start with, what's in the name, money. So what is the money story from MMT?
Yeah, so it's modern monetary theory because someone on Bill Mitchell's blog started calling it that. And we had the same conversation with each other at the time. Well, it's not really a theory, it's just a set of identities. But the name stuck and it was popularized. It was spreading and it caught on. And so we thought, okay, let's just take the publicity and leave it alone. What's the difference what the name is? And so modern came from Randy Ray's book, Understanding Modern Money, way back, and 1998, which is the excellent book, probably the best one written on the subject. And I worked with him every line for 2 years on that book, so that's a very good one. Mm-hmm. And he got the word modern from Keynes, who was being tongue-in-cheek, and he said, yes, it's modern, it's only been around 4,000 years or something like that, or 6,000, 10,000, whatever it was. So it's modern. He was just being his usual flip, talented writer that he is. And so we use that. And modern because we're the ones started talking about it, and then theory because that's what the guy called it, who was on Bill's blog. So what we've recognized is that the currency itself is a simple public monopoly.
Okay. So only the government issues it.
Yeah, the government is the single supplier of the thing that it demands for payment of taxes. It's a monopoly. And it's a coercive monopoly. If you don't pay your taxes, you go to jail or lose your house or lose your car. Otherwise, it doesn't work. And there aren't any other schools of thought that start with that, with that money story. And everything we do begins with that money story. That's our understanding. That's where you start your understanding of anything financial. Without that, you're not starting at the beginning, as I spoke to you before the show. So that's the beginning. So the beginning is a government that we'll presume wants to provision itself, which means it wants soldiers for the army, it wants judges and lawyers in the legal system, it wants public health workers, it wants
to get stuff done.
Yeah. And it wants to transfer real goods and services from private to public domains. And so it needs labor, it needs food for the cafeteria, it needs fuel for the army, and it needs all these things. And in the case of let's say representative government, the population has agreed and given the government a mandate to provision itself to serve public purpose. It's all presumed to serve public purpose. Okay, so how does it do that? If it just printed up a currency, nobody would care about that currency. They couldn't spend it. So the whole thing begins, the whole provisioning process begins with a tax liability. And in the case of our government's payable only in the tax credit that the government establishes will extinguish that tax liability. That's the US dollar, the British pound, the euro.
Yeah.
Okay. So the basis behind the whole system is a tax liability. And for the purposes of discussion, I just say, let's say a real estate tax on everybody's house without getting into the merits of real estate tax versus other tax. It's just to facilitate the understanding.
You could have chosen income tax, but we're going with real estate tax for simplicity's sake.
Tell you the problem starting with an income tax. If people decide not to work and not report their income, you've got issues. So you have to have a tax on imputed income, and it gets complex. And it's also pro-cyclical. As the economy does better, it ramps up, and it gets worse, it goes down. So you're fighting a moving target, which it works, okay? But if you just want to talk about the fundamental case of government provisioning itself, you don't want to get into all those discussions right away. With a real estate tax, you don't have anywhere near those. You have a few issues, but nothing else. But it's something we can understand. There's a tax on your house. If you don't pay the tax, you're going to lose your house.
Yeah. So how I see this a little bit is sort of us discussing, hey, let's start a government somewhere. We have sort of all the legal stuff or the non-economic legal stuff in place. We have people, we have that, but we're dirt poor. We don't have a currency. We're going to start a government. Let's start with...
You don't have people in the government, though. How do you get people to work in the government?
Yeah. It's just you and me at the moment.
Right. So what we do is we put a tax, a real estate tax. The government imposes a real estate tax. In this case, it's a tax payable in US dollars, which is tax credit. And that causes homeowners and even renters indirectly who have to pay rent to a homeowner who needs the money. But it causes the population to need the money to pay the tax, quite simply. And so people are out looking for paid work. They're not looking to volunteer for the American Cancer Society, to do good. They need money because taxes are an ongoing drain. Okay, they're a liability. It's an ongoing liability. They create enormous anxieties. All this hunger for money, this greed, this almost non-human behavior, this lust for money is a byproduct, a derivative of a tax liability. Without the tax liability, it isn't there.
Yeah.
So,
and this is also an order, right? You start with the taxes, and then you have the fertile ground there for money.
And the interesting thing is, people once say there's tax liabilities, and now there's dollars that buy things. They can never get enough. There's just no end to this insatiable desire for these tax credits, and it drives civilization. Okay, so what we're creating is, by definition, today's definition, unemployment, people looking for paid work. So before the tax liability, no one was looking for paid work. in that currency because it wasn't there.
Yeah, so they were just living a tribal life, doing stuff for each other because they knew each other, but they're not unemployed.
Right. Well, they might have been, working for Japanese yen because, you could buy things in Japan from people who needed that for their tax liability. Okay, but they weren't looking for US dollars in this country before, 1792 or whatever, until there were tax liabilities in US dollars. And so when you come up with, nobody was looking for euro before the tax liability switched from local currencies over there to euro. That created the need for euro, and it creates this powerful need for euro. Look what it drives, okay? And so the tax liability creates unemployment in that it creates people looking for paid work in that currency. And without those tax liabilities in that currency, you would not have people looking for paid work in that currency. Right. In a non-monetary society that you alluded to, you won't have people looking for paid work at all.
But here is modern monetary theory is already very different from all of economics, right? Because we don't tend to think about unemployment like that in terms of euro unemployment or yen unemployment. We think about it as unemployment.
Right. So unfortunately, that's true. And so our discussions on unemployment have missed the essence of unemployment. And because of that, what we do and why we do it have been, clouded, and it's still there. Once you understand why it's there, how it got there, what you do about it, it wouldn't be there anymore. Okay, but it's there because of this lack of understanding. Now, the sad thing is, I think it's only maybe 250 years ago, everybody understood what I just said. Okay, it's not, it's modern as Keynes said, because people have forgotten it recently, but this is not
that core element has something from a very ancient or old economic tradition called chartalism, I think, right? Which at the core sort of taxes give money value. Taxes give fiat money value.
Right, and that was Knapp and whatever. But you had Adam Smith when he looked at the U.S. colonies and their paper money, saying, the prince can once the money's needed to pay taxes, he can then set the value of it, which I'll get to in a second. Okay, so that was Smith. And then before that, you had the Romans. This is how they operated. They would tax the territories they conquered in their own coin. And then to get the coin to pay the tax, they had to send grains to Rome. And it's the same thing, right? Transferring resources from private to public domain. And that's how the whole Roman Empire functioned. And then before that, you go back to the Sumerians or whatever. You see these old pictures from 4,000 years ago of stones with holes in them and a pebble fit in the hole. Those were tax credits, because this thing made an impression in here and the government could then spend it and people would take it, and then because they could use it to pay their taxes. And then they fit it in to make sure it fit in the same hole, and now it wasn't counterfeit. And England ran on tally sticks for how long? Hundreds of years, right? And so everybody understood how that worked. There were taxes payable in tally sticks, which were done at the medieval fairs. And so they could spend these pieces of wood, and which would then come back and be made to fit into the stock. And
weren't tally sticks private money, though, in the sense that we're now talking as money as a creature of the state, right?
Well, we're talking about the state wants to provision itself. And there can be other things out there. It doesn't matter. All right. So you go into the United States or you go into Europe and people are trading other currencies, they're trading cryptos, they're trading everything. But the states can still provision themselves as long as the tax they're the source of the thing that they need to pay that's needed to pay taxes. And so people will work for the state currency to provision the government. And beyond that, it doesn't really matter what currencies people use or why.
And sometimes
this is the core of everything.
Sometimes you see this popping up again, right? Like with Greece or Italy, for example, at the height of the euro crisis, they were talking about, hey, we want to introduce our own money. And they were talking about monetizing tax liability specifically again. Yeah.
And I tried to work with them on that, and they just didn't work out. I don't want to get into the politics, but it wasn't. It was disappointing, let's put it that way, because it was right there and they were all set up to do this. And it's just too hard for them. Let's just leave it at that. So
interesting. I think we'll get back to this later, indeed.
Okay.
So we have taxes, we have money.
Okay, so number one, the government wants to provision itself, so it establishes a tax liability. It's created unemployment. Now it can go hire those people to work for the government, which is the whole point of the system. It then pays them the dollars or the euro, the tax credit, and then the taxes get paid. Okay, so the tax is getting paid is at the end of the chain, not at it's not at the beginning.
Yeah.
It doesn't start with people paying taxes so the government can spend. It starts with a tax liability, so people need the money. They show up for work, they get paid, and then they pay the tax. I call that the sequence. And so that is the correct sequence. And that sequence is not understood by any member of Parliament or any member of the U.S. Congress. It's just not. And that's where they go wrong. I mean, from right at the beginning like that. So once you understand that sequence, now you have a framework for analysis that's very different from the mainstream. The mainstream can say G minus T, government spending minus taxes, but they've got the idea that the taxes come in and the government spends it.
Mm-hmm.
When you get the correct framework, you know that tax liabilities first, which has nothing to do with paying taxes. Okay, then spending, and then the payment of tax. Okay, that just changes all around. And once you look at it that way, everything makes sense. And you can explain everything that's happened in every monetary system in the world since the beginning of time. If you're an archaeologist and you don't understand this and you're finding these coins, good chance you're going to get the wrong story of what's happening. If you understand this, you get a very coherent, logical story of what's going on.
So, okay. Right? So, for me, what really helped me sort of is indeed to think about this as like, okay, I'm going to start from scratch. I'm going to start a government. How will I go about it? Not by printing money first, or not by necessarily having gold first. It's just like especially if you're an island or on an island, tax liability first. Then people need that, so you're gonna start issuing money to pay for stuff to get people to do stuff for you. I guess, right, to work for you.
Okay, but
or to get their stuff.
You don't have to get. I've done this 3 times right from the beginning. First at the University of Missouri at Kansas City in I think the end of '96, sometime in 1996. They wanted students to do community service. That's a government looking to provision itself. They wanted the students to do this work. So how do you get students to do this work? So I suggested you impose a tax liability on these students. And the tax liability they imposed was the student had to turn in 20 buckaroos, that's what they called their currency, at the end of semester, or you don't get your grades. And you don't get advance. Okay, that's serious. Okay, so they have serious taxing authority. It's all driven by taxing authority. You have to turn in 20 of these buckaroos. Well, what's a buckaroo? Well, if you work an hour at the hospital or volunteer an hour at the police department, you'll get 1 buckaroo for every hour of community service you do at our designated locations.
So are there other papers? This sounds like an experiment, Warren, right? Are there papers about this? That sounds like an interesting paper.
Yes, it's been written up. Been written up many times, and Phil Armstrong's doing a new one because Fidel Kaboub's done the same thing at the Denison University, and Professor Terzi at Franklin University has Franklin francs. So there's Denison dollars, Franklin francs, and UMKC buckaroos. They've all been fully functioning for a long time, and they all are a monetary system and demonstrate what I'm going to call the base case for analysis. They start with a tax liability on the students. The students have to earn these coupons. They get paid, and then they pay the tax. And I did the first, and they learn national accounting. So I did the first national accounting meeting down at UMKC, and the tax was, $1,000 for all the students, and the total amount that they earned was $1,100, and then they paid $1,000 in taxes, and so there was $1,000 left in the economy as savings. Some students there's 100 left as savings. So there's 100 out there somewhere. So they came in, they volunteered, they earned $1,100, they paid $1,000 collectively. There was still 100 of them in student hands somewhere. And so that's from the student's point of view. From the government's point of view, they collected $1,000 and they spent $1,100. They spent more than they collected. Well, first of all, how could they not? Okay, that's called a deficit. The school ran a deficit. Right from the beginning, you have to. And the school's deficit is equal to the savings in the student body, to the last buckaroo. That's, like any third grader can understand this. This is not rocket science. And that's national income accounting. Public debt of $31 trillion in the U.S. is held in accounts at the Fed, and it's the net financial assets of the economy. It's not hard, okay? And so these things have made it explicit. Now, what's interesting is where does the value of this currency come from? Where's the value of the buckaroo? Well, it's a monopoly. Monopoly is micro 101. You learn it in the first half hour. It's the easiest thing you learn in economics is how monopoly works. The school's got the buckaroos. The students need them. It tells them what they have to do to get it. You have to work 1 hour. Okay, well, now it's worth 1 hour of labor. And if you want to get some other student to work for you, you've got to pay him dollars or something it's going to be enough dollars to compensate him for the 1 hour. Well, back then it was $5 you could get a student to do the work for you, so you didn't have to do it. Today it's $25 to get a student to do the same work for you, to go to the same hospital and volunteer.
But
so what happened?
Sorry. Yeah.
But the value,
yeah.
Look, in terms of dollars, the value of the buckaroo appreciated 500%, 25 years.
So, and that's another way of saying the buckaroo was not inflationary and the dollar was.
Yeah, and it was not deflation. It was internally stable. It bought 1 hour of student labor back then. Why? Because that's what the school pays. That's not going to change unless the school starts paying 5 buckaroos an hour instead of 1, and then it'd still be $5, right?
So
the price level is a function of what the issuer tells you have to do to get the money, of the prices it pays when it spends. But that's simple monopoly. You can say that's MMT.
Yeah.
Once you recognize the currency as a monopoly, then monopolists are price setter. I mean, this is not hard stuff.
Yeah. Okay. So I really like this analogy.
And there's no other source of value. That's it. Without that, it's a non-starter. It doesn't work at all. So
what do you mean there's no other source of value?
Well, if we say a buckaroo, you have to earn these, and we don't say how much we're going to pay. The school says, the student says, well, how many do I get to work an hour? We say, well, I don't know.
So
then how do you get, it can't work.
So could you say that the buckaroo in this case is anchored to that hour of labor that the university has set for it? That's the anchor for the currency.
Yes. And the university could have instead said, okay, you have to turn in an ounce of gold and we'll give you a buckaroo. Or you have to ride a bicycle for a half hour and we'll give you a buckaroo. They could have said whatever they want. But that then is the value, because that's how monopoly works. They got the thing you need. They dictate terms of trade, terms of exchange. That's what a monopolist does. That's why we try and not have monopolists in our market economies, because you don't have a market when you have a monopoly. It obviates it.
Yeah, and so I like this analogy. So let's stick with it a little bit. I think you already touched a little bit on inflation, because that's we've had sort of taxes, money in our theory, but we haven't really had inflation yet. So,
but before you say inflation, I think what you want to do is start with, where does the price level come from? Because inflation is how the price level changes. But there is no mainstream theory of where the price level comes from, except we start historically with the one we had yesterday. Yeah, they don't have, it's an infinite regression. They have no idea where the price level came from, except we try and figure out, and therefore we try and figure out what makes it change. Well, MMT, we tell you where the price level comes from. It's a monopoly. The monopolist sets price. Micro 101, it's right there in the textbook.
So this is what you mean when you say, which is sometimes controversial, but within this framework, not necessarily, but this is what you mean when you say the government determines inflation. Because
what determines the price level?
They determine the price level, and so they determine the changes in the price level.
Correct. So if the government said you can earn $1 for an hour's work, then the buckaroo today is $25 if you want to get another student to do it for you. If they say you have to work 2 hours to get a buckaroo, now it's worth $50. If they say you only have to work a half hour, it's worth $12.50. But there's no other source of absolute value of this buckaroo except what the monopolist says you have to do to get it. Markets can only do relative value. And that's in all the models and everything else. They're all relative value models because that's all there is. There is no external absolute value. You have to assume that. And what they do is assume yesterday's price level as their starting point, because they don't have a source of the price level. So first, I've given you a source of the price level, and then I can tell you what makes it change. It's when government changes the terms of exchange, then the price level changes. And it's filtered through all the institutional structure, of course.
But okay, in your buckaroo case, this is simple to follow, because the university sets an hour of labor that it deems worthy. And
now, the U.S. government could have done that.
But they don't, right? They don't. In modern economies, it doesn't work like that, in the sense that
we're not saying
there's not one anchor, right?
Right. I'm not saying they should. But what I'm saying is, in my base case for analysis, you have to start the analysis somewhere. Let's start with the buckaroo model.
Sure.
Tax liability, no unemployment. At 25 years, anybody who wants to go to the hospital and work can get paid in buckaroos. The budget deficit, the market decides the deficit. The students decide, okay, my tax liability is 1,000. Collectively, we're going to earn 1,100 or 1,200. The school doesn't decide that. The market decides that. So all these market-friendly people, we got the market deciding the price, the deficit. What more could you ask for? And no inflation. And It's a permanent zero rate policy. The school never paid a support rate on the buckaroos. If you saved them, you got nothing.
Yeah.
Just kept your buckaroos. So that's our base case for analysis. Now, it's also the job guarantee. Anybody who wants a job can go get it at these nonprofits.
Yeah, that's what the buckaroo, the university has, right? That it has a job guarantee, basically. And that's why the job guarantee is core to monetary theory.
Well, it's part of the base case for analysis. If you think that we shouldn't have a job guarantee, that's fine. So let's look at the university and say, well, what should they have done to make this work better? How about if we don't guarantee everybody a job at the hospital? Would that make it better? I'd say, I don't think so. But if you can prove it, we'll give it a try. And that's happened. The professors will come in and say, well, why don't we pay interest on the money? It's like, why? You think that'll make it more valuable if you just give people, hand them out? Well, no, I guess not. Okay, so like, why are we doing this? I mean, you can if you want to mix everybody up and do it, but what's your reason? And nobody's ever been able to defend a deviation from the base case in 25 years.
So they've tried. Yeah. And now I'm also hearing another controversial thing that you get maybe into Twitter feuds about. There shouldn't be, the base interest rate is zero. In the buckaroo case, I think people can follow you that this makes sense. But why do you think then that in our modern economies we always observe an interest rate higher than zero? Is it just stupid?
It's a carryover from I think it's an anachronism from the gold standard, where you had to raise and lower rates because you're worried about convertibility of the money. We don't have convertible currency anymore. We just have tax credits and non-convertible tax credits. And so that's what they used to do. And when we switched over, they just kept doing it. And they kept the old reasons for doing it. It's going to make the currency stronger and whatnot, even though every central bank study has shown that there is no correlation. You can't trade currencies based on interest rate differentials. You're going to lose a lot of money. But that's it. I just think it's an anachronism from a previous regime.
So okay. No, so up to this point, I'm with you. At least for the buckaroo example, for sure. But I wonder if it might get a bit tricky if you translate it to bigger cases, which
I think
is something that happens a lot, right?
I think it's the opposite of getting tricky. You wind up with something like right now for the UK. What would I propose? Go to a permanent zero rate policy. You don't have to sell gilts. Just let the excess funds pile up in reserve accounts at the BO of England, or if you need collateral for some structural purpose, you don't want to run through Parliament, allow them to issue 3-month bills or something like that. But basically, no securities, permanent zero rate policy, and job guarantee. And you've put a tax out there that's created more unemployed people than you want to hire. You made a mistake. Lower the tax or hire them, one or the other. You don't do that. You don't decide you want to hire 50 people and then put a tax on the economy that creates 200 unemployed. Hire the 50 and let the others rot because you've created them. They weren't unemployed before your tax caused them to be unemployed.
Wait, Warren, because I would love to get into more complex discussions with you about the UK and all of that. But I just think we haven't fully covered the base case yet. Because, so I just want to ask you 2 or so more questions about this and then have a look at the chat, because I see quite a lot of people also already asking questions about this. And I think I want to just make sure that everybody comes along with our train of thought before we get into a bit more complex cases. But okay, so about your framework. So let's go back to the universities. So I just wanted to throw you a little bit of a curveball. And let's bring in an internet favorite, which is hyperinflation. In what can you imagine a scenario in which that university with the buckaroos, there's hyperinflation in the buckaroos? Could this happen in any way? And how would it happen?
Sure. They would just raise the wages that they're paying to work. They'd say $1 an hour, we'll give. Then the next month they say we'll give you 10 buckaroos an hour. Then the next month we'll give you 100 buckaroos an hour, and they just keep devaluing the currency. It used to be called crying down the value of the currency back in the Middle Ages. I think the king would cry down the value.
But why would the university do that? That makes no sense, right?
Of course not. But governments do it all the time. I was just down in Argentina in April, and what they're doing is nonsensical from the correct framework for analysis. Under their framework for analysis, which is some mixture of old fixed exchange rate and IMF gobbledygook, then it makes sense, okay? But if you go into the assumptions, they don't tie into the actual debits and credits. But they don't seem to care. They just keep doing it. They're up to
Okay, but how about this one then? I'm not fully satisfied with your example because I think I can think of a way that we get hyperinflation in our university simple case.
Okay.
Because if the university fails, if it goes out of business, then I think we'll also have hyperinflation in buckaroos, in the remaining buckaroos.
Okay.
And that's not a choice of the university, right? It's not their action.
Right. Yeah. So let's say what you're saying is if they lose their taxing authority.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
If students no longer have to earn it. And that's correct. You look at any currency, where taxing authority has been lost, and it goes, there's no value. Because what's a tax credit worth without a tax? It's worth nothing.
Yeah. So that is
just tax credits.
And that is what we often actually see, right? Like they often bring up Weimar Germany, Zimbabwe. These were collapsing governments. And
I happened to do a paper on Weimar, and it was different. But it was true in Lebanon, I think, a few decades ago when the Civil War started. They couldn't collect taxes anymore. Currency just hyperinflated. But most of these other places, that's not the case. It's not the case that tax collection has ceased. But it will do it. If you eliminate all U.S. taxes, and the tax credit's worth nothing. U.S. dollar's worth zero.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm sure we'll get back to Weimar then.
So
and
let's look at.
But that's a case, right?
Let's look at Europe. There are no more taxes payable in lira or pesetas, and all those currencies are worth zero.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Sure.
The only way what happened was that they switched the tax liabilities to euro, and then the European Central Bank bought those other currencies at the exchange rates. And people sold them for euro because now euro was needed to pay the tax and to live their lives. And that was it. Once they stopped, those other currencies aren't worth anything because there are no more tax liabilities denominated in those currencies.
Okay. One final thing about this in our simple example, which I think we need to flesh out a little bit more. That is unemployment. So in our university case, like in the real world, we see unemployment all the time. That's the norm, right? Yeah. In your university system, I suspect we don't. Why not?
Because there are always jobs available that pay in buckaroos. The hospital will always take you in for an hour and give you a buckaroo. Police station will take you for an hour and give you a buckaroo, whatever you want. We have open-ended employment that pays in buckaroos. Mm-hmm. And that's not inflationary, no matter what the deficit is.
So that's the job guarantee, basically, right?
That's what's become to be called the job guarantee. I didn't call it that originally. It's in soft currency economics, showing that as a policy option, you can have an open-ended job as a buffer stock because all currencies are ultimately supported by some kind of buffer stock policy. It's a question of which buffer stock you choose. And the university chose the labor buffer stock for their currency, which is an option for the government.
Yeah, but you're also saying that our governments choose that, right? But you're saying they choose to keep an unemployed buffer. Yeah,
buffer stock. Right. Because I'll give them the benefit of the doubt, and they just don't know any better. They're looking at it wrong way around. They've got the sequence wrong, and so that's the consequence.
So, but I think this for me was a complex part of MMT.
All right, let's see if this helps. Why does any student work for a buckaroo? There's only two things they can do with it. They can pay the tax or not pay the tax. Mm-hmm. So they either pay the tax or they save it.
Or they can pay each other, I would imagine.
Right. And then the next person who sells something, why did he sell something for a buckaroo? Either to pay the tax or to save it.
Yeah.
So by the end of the day, whoever's holding them decided to save it. The savers are there voluntarily at the end of the day. Somebody sold something because they'd rather have the buckaroo than whatever they sold. Their labor, bag of M&Ms, whatever it was. The university, no telling what it was, right? Yeah. So, because you can't get a smaller, more open economy, and it's not the prime currency. It's not competing with any currency or anything like that. And it exists, stable for 25 years while everything around it inflates away. Okay, so anyway, so there's only two reasons the economy, at the macro level, we look at macro now, so we don't have any fallacies of composition, will work for the currency, will trade goods and services with currency. It's either to pay the tax or to net save. And you can argue about what causes savings desires to go up or down, but they are what they are. And in the public debt, are the dollars spent by the government that have not yet been used to pay taxes because people in this society have elected to net save them. It's all voluntary. And that is those are the net financial assets in the economy.
Mm-hmm.
And that's all it is. And it's there because that's what people want for whatever reason. And it's in real terms, by the way. So if you get inflation, the price level goes up. So the price level doubled, and everybody wants to walk around with twice as much cash in their pocket, twice as much cash when they go shopping, twice as much savings for retirement. So it's always in real terms, whatever the savings desire is.
Okay, so I think this is actually a good point to see if.
So does that address your last concern about the?
Yes, but I would definitely like to explore it a little bit further later on. Sure. Because this does remain a tricky explanation. Yeah. But I think, let's see. I think we've covered the basis in the sense that we've covered sort of. Okay, if this helped me at least. Like, okay, think about it. You want to start a government from scratch. Start with a tax liability because that will give your currency value. Then you start issuing that currency. Yeah. Then I think you said
the currency value is defined by what the government then says you have to do to get the currency, the tax credit. Yeah. Monopolist has this thing. He's a sole supplier, a single supplier. And it tells you what you have to do to get it. You have to do 1 hour of community service. You have to sell me, I'll give you 1 billion of these for one jet plane. He's telling you what you have to do to get them.
Yeah, and you're right. This is an interesting thing to add at this point. How I would phrase it is that you have to choose an anchor if you start from scratch. Yeah. Your university chose labor as an anchor. You could also choose land as an anchor if you do a land tax or real estate.
You can choose toothpaste, whatever you want. But look at a football stadium.
But doesn't it have a
football game?
Doesn't it have a football game? Right?
But we got a football game.
Sorry, yeah.
They have the ticket. They have the tickets. They tell you what you have to pay. There's a limited number of seats, or they could throw it out to the market. They don't do that. Or the electric company in London, they just tell you the price. Now, if they don't like the consequences, they could raise the price or lower the price, but they still have to set the price. And I'm not saying there aren't consequences for these other people, but they're still price setters. And of course, the football stadium, they don't collect the ticket first and then sell it. They sell the ticket first and then collect it, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If you don't understand that, if you think they're collecting them first and then selling them, you're going to get a lot of things confused when you're trying to make policy. And that's what our governments do. They got the sequence backwards, and it confuses policy. I'm being polite here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that. But since we are live, okay. So we have the sequence. The job guarantee is potentially an anchor and a way to avoid unemployment.
It's my base case for analysis. And if you want to have the government buy gold instead of labor, fine. And we can modify that. Let's see what that does. Now, gold is fully employed because anybody who digs gold can sell it for $1 buckaroo or something, whatever they put the price on it. And then that has to get traded for other things. It's like, why would you do that? But you can. And we did as a nation because we had other reasons.
For a long time, yeah.
For a long time, yeah. It's a lot of things. If you don't understand what's going on behind the curtain, you can do a lot of things that, on a look back, don't make any sense, right? But at the time, they made perfect sense.
Okay, so I think we had that covered. So unemployment then, and then you can have hyperinflation if the government collapses or if it chooses.
Or if tax authority ceases, If the cessation of tax authority takes away value from tax credits. If you're going to get a solar tax credit for doing solar cells, and all of a sudden nobody owes any taxes anymore, that's not worth anything.
All right, Warren, shall we see what people are saying and see if there are some questions? So actually, Carlo is helping me today to collect some questions. Carlo, do you have some for me, perhaps? I will actually go through maybe one first because there's a bit of a time lag. So I definitely have one, and then Carlo, if you can help me out. So Rohit Bangalore asks to you, Warren, why did QE not cause inflation in the 2010s, and why is it different this time?
All right, so you have QE, and it's a little different from Europe because you're buying national government debt, not the ECB's own debt, but it's with the guarantee, it's all the same thing. But okay, so what they called quantitative easing is in the U.S. the government purchased U.S. Treasury securities. So what is a U.S. Treasury security? Right? It's an account at the Federal Reserve Bank. It's U.S. dollars in an account at the Federal Reserve Bank. If I buy a 1-year Treasury security, for $1 million, I give them $1 million, and it goes into a 1-year treasury security, which is like a 1-year savings account. It earns interest, and at the end of the year, I get my $1 million back. So I still have the $1 million. It's just in a bank, the Federal Reserve Bank, in a time deposit instead of in maybe an overnight deposit. Let's say a checking account where you can get your money every day. So let's give the example. And most people will pay out of their checking accounts at the Fed, which are, I'm not saying this in a very linear fashion, but the Fed has two kinds of accounts, just like any other bank. They have transactions accounts that they call reserve accounts. They're overnight accounts. You have dollar balances and you can use them anytime you want. They also have time deposits, like regular banks have savings accounts, certificates of deposit, where you can specify, I'm going to leave my money in for a year before I can get it out. I'm lending the bank the money for a year or 2 years or 5 years, at an interest rate. Well, the Federal Reserve Bank is a bank that does it's the exact same thing as any other bank. So when you buy a treasury security, you instruct the Fed, your member bank instructs the Fed to debit the reserve account. In other words, subtract the money in the overnight account, in the checking account, and to credit the money, the balance in a time deposit called a treasury security. So it's just shifting the dollars from a reserve account to a securities account, to use precise language. That's what buying a treasury security is. You still have the dollars. They're just in a time deposit instead of an overnight deposit, presumably because you didn't want to use that money for a year anyway. You'd rather have it in a time deposit than an overnight deposit. You like the interest rate better, you're using it for collateral somewhere. I don't know. I really don't care. But you voluntarily decided, gee, I'd rather be out a year, And that's the situation before QE. QE comes along, the Fed comes into the market and says, okay, I'm buying 1-year deposits and I'm going to pay for them by crediting your reserve account, your overnight account. Okay, so if I were to sell my securities at that point, the Fed would debit my securities account back to zero and it would credit my reserve account. So I have the $1 million I started with in my reserve account. In either case, I still have the $1 million. It's just a question of which account at the bank it's in. Is it in a savings account or in a checking account? Okay, when I buy securities, I'm moving my money from checking to savings. When I sell securities, I'm moving my money from savings to checking. Okay, how does that affect the economy? And why would that affect inflation or anything else? And people have pondered over that a lot and largely come up with, they really don't think it's going to make much difference at all. In fact, I asked this question to some people from the Bank of Japan. I was at the Bank of England in the late 90s when they first started doing this. And I talked to the officer from the Bank of Japan and I said, okay, so you're buying, JGBs, government securities, with yen, and you're paying the banks in yen. So their securities account balance goes down, their reserve account balance goes up. Like, how is that going to change anything? It's not like the banks have a line out the door of people trying to borrow in yen if they only had the money. They always have infinite liquidity to make loans. It's got nothing to do with that. It's like, why do you expect this to do anything? It was Andrew Crockett was next to me. He was at the Bank of England at the time. He looks at the guy and he goes, yeah, what do you got to say to that? And he says, well, that's just our policy. And that's what we're going to do and we'll see what happens. Okay, that was 30 years ago, more. So 26 years ago. And of course, nothing happened. The Bank of Japan did more QE than anybody could imagine. There was never any reason from the beginning to think this was policy that was going to have any effect on anything, whether it's QE or QT. It doesn't. Now, they definitely have placebo effects because people think it's going to do something. And if you're on a gold standard, it would certainly do something because now all that money you could convert it into gold and get the gold out of the central bank. But that's not applicable. So with floating exchange rate policy, there's no reason to think it could do anything. And now we've had 30 years of demonstration and Fed research and BOE research, Bank of Japan, BOJ research, and they can't find anything except what they call placebo effect. When it gets announced, markets will move because people think it's going to do something and then fizzles out. So they have plenty of that, but they don't have any actual channels from QE to inflation or anything. It just doesn't exist.
So could you also say that it is in part a swapping of one government liability for another and if you look at it through the MMT lens, then that doesn't matter because all that matters is liabilities that can help you pay taxes.
Yeah, so it's not even, the liabilities are still US dollars. It's just one liability you can access overnight, the other one is term. So it's even less, you know what I mean? Even more so to what you said. And so there's, you're just switching your dollars from one account at the Fed to another account. You still have the dollars. And you're doing it voluntarily, presumably because you weren't going to spend them or you are going to spend them. Otherwise, you wouldn't switch them.
Hey, and Warren, I have another question.
Yeah, sure.
So this question is by Terry Moore, who asks, can MMT actually work if it's liable to be abused by governments/monopolies? Yeah, I think this also relates to a sentiment that I come across often, which looks at money as something that the government will abuse, devalue at the expense of savers.
Sure. Okay, but MMT is the framework for analysis of the monetary system. It's not something you use or do. It's not a policy. And once you understand the monetary system, are you more likely to cause damage to your population than good? Maybe. Either you believe in an informed electorate or you don't. And a lot of people don't think the electorate should be informed. They think, if people ever knew this or if people ever knew that, everything would go to heck. Right? But I personally believe in an informed electorate. If you think it's better if people don't understand how things work, that's fine. We each have a vote in the election and, we'll see what happens. But that's what the question comes down to. But you believe in a representative government that's informed or you don't.
Yeah, so MMT teaches us about the world, but it doesn't necessarily say how government should run it. However, there are, and this was another question I got on a post previously, there are quite a few MMT economists, such as, for example, Stephanie Kelton, that do seem to be quite prescriptive. And you also sometimes, I think, maybe, for example, say, well, actually, the proper interest rate for Turkey should be 0, which is also prescriptive, right? How do you look at these two?
Well, you can look at it that way. What I say is when any government pays interest, they're paying out money, currency, tax credits, and they're increasing their deficit spending. When you increase deficit spending, you're in our market economy, just completely on the supply side, you're putting pressure on your currency. And if we look back at the buckaroos, and I was asked, it was actually Matt Forstad who said, he thought he wanted to pay interest on buckaroos or something. Was it Matt? No, Andrea wanted to pay interest on the Swiss francs, on his Franklin francs. Well, let's say you gave all the students, 100% interest on their savings, 1,000% interest on their savings. How much work would they do? Would they go over to volunteer at the hospital if they could just make the money on interest? No. So the total amount you can spend goes down when you start paying interest. And if you try and spend the same amount by paying higher prices, which governments tend to do, now you're just driving up prices. You're causing the price level to go down. You're redefining your currency downward every time you pay more, which you're driven to do, not understanding the system, every time you pay more interest. And you can see this happening, all over the world as they raise rates, if the debt is high enough, where the interest payment is meaningful. Mm-hmm. The public debt's very low. It's de minimis. It doesn't. You can't detect it. But once you get, the U.S. at 120% of debt to GDP. Every mainstream economist was warning us about this 10, 15 years ago when we were at 50 or 60%. When the debt gets too high, all that interest is going to cause inflation unless you raise taxes. You can't just raise, the problem with the public debt is eventually you're going to have to raise taxes or all the interest is going to cause inflation. All right, here we are. And the interest is causing inflation, so stop paying it. And the other thing is, there are a lot of people that favor like basic income. Mm-hmm. Well, paying interest is a form of basic income, but it's only paid to people who already have money and in proportion to how much they already have. You can't imagine anything more regressive than that out of government policy. And that's what we're doing. The Fed has decided to increase rates from 0 to 3.5, paying 3.5% basic interest income to people who already have money in proportion to how much they already have, just flooding the economy with these, it's almost $1 trillion now with 31 trillion public debt. Annually, it's approaching that, and saying this is how we fight inflation, by giving people with money more money. That's all they do. There's no other policy that changes at the Fed operationally when they raise rates, except they turn on the fire hose and start pumping more money out into the economy.
But Warren, isn't there one difference between our Buckaroo University example and modern economies when it comes to interest rate, in the sense that you, at this point, seem to be talking about it mostly as you pay out interest rates, and I understand that, okay, the government is a net payer of interest rates.
Yes.
However, part of the interest rate instrument is also that a lot of banks essentially borrow from the government, aka the central bank basically. And a lot of the channels that traditional economists talk about go through that. So it doesn't go through paying out interest rate, but it says, okay, if we're going to charge higher interest rate for banks to borrow, they will charge it to their customers, and that will reduce investment and spending. Does that fit? How does that fit in?
Well, in this case, let me start with the real world, and then I'll go to my model. So for every dollar borrowed, there's a dollar saved. Now, they don't, banks don't take government money and lend it. Okay, the loan itself creates a deposit, right?
Yeah.
The causation from deposit. So even though they might get that, the actual, if the government credits the bank's reserve account and then the bank makes a loan, the reserve account doesn't go down. It stays the same. Okay, but on their books, when they buy your signed note for your home mortgage, they credit your account with a new pounds or new euro or whatever, and new dollars over here. And they keep the loan on their books. So they have an asset and a liability. The dollars that they got from the government don't have anything to do with that. So they might get loan guarantees from the government. So now they will buy your signed note, where before they wouldn't do it because Jay Powell's guaranteeing your loan. But that's a different story. So number one, what you said though is how a lot of people think about it, and it's just not reality. It's just not how it works. So that's a distortion that creates, again, confuses conclusions. So, but in the economy, for every dollar borrowed, there's a dollar saved to the penny, or some accountant's got to stay late and find his mistake. Banks have assets and liabilities; they're equal. You have loans and you have deposits. Now you've got net worth, which is a form of a deposit, but you got a deposit somewhere in the system. And they're equal. And so whenever rates go up, borrowers pay more, but savers get more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So the borrowers pay more. So the question is, which one's more powerful? Yes, borrowers have to pay more, so that hurts them. But savers get more, so now they can buy more products from the business that was borrowing, and so they can afford to pay it. If those two are equal, if all the money that the borrowers paid in interest was spent, then it would just be a shift in wealth within the economy, which could have distortions we don't want to have, and which could be unpleasant distortions, but it's still just a shift. If there's a difference, then there can be a difference in the overall spending, GDP, the whole macroeconomy. Those tendencies to either spend or not spend interest income are called the propensities to consume interest income, that type of thing. Yeah. Called the propensities. And so the Federal Reserve studies these propensities to see, are they different? Do borrowers get hurt more than savers get help? Do borrowers have to pay more and savers don't spend more? They just let it pile up. And there's a guy at the Fed, I used to visit, Steve Oliner. He was an officer there for 20 years. He retired a few years ago. That was his job. And he'd say, well, the answer he gave right to the end, until he retired, was, look, we believe that there is a difference in these propensities and that it does hurt the borrowers more than it helps the savers. He says, but I've been doing the econometrics for a long time. I can't detect it. So, okay, so there probably is.
When did he do that? Yeah. Like, when was his, what years are we talking about?
He probably retired 5 or 6 years ago.
Because I could imagine that as wealth inequality shot up, that the propensity difference becomes bigger. Yeah. So just
I agree. We don't know. So all we can do is look at the data, because you can't measure it. It's a very hard thing to measure. You can only guess. So you look at the data. When we raise rates, does the economy pick up, or does it actually slow down? Mm-hmm. And I was looking at this back in 2008 when they were cutting rates. We were at 60% debt to GDP. Out publicly saying, I think these lower rates are going to slow down the economy because the income effect is going to be a lot stronger on the savers than the borrowing effect. We're not going to get this increase in borrowing to offset the decline in savings income. The propensities might even be running the other way. And you could see for 10 years of zero rate. And why did I guess that? Because I looked at Japan. Now, Japan had much higher debt to GDP, but they had zero rates for 20 years back then and didn't have runaway borrowing or anything else. And so I didn't think, now this is in the opposite direction. I didn't think borrowing was going to get helped by the lower rates. And a lot of this is just looking at the data. It's experience. I remember years before, I was on the phone to someone in Australia. This must have been in the 70s, late 70s, no, maybe late 80s. And I said, how's the real estate market? Maybe late 80s. And he says, it's pretty good now. Mortgage rates are 17.5. He said, but I think if they put them up to 18, it's going to kill it. I go, okay, thank you. I'm an investor. I was a trader back then. I was in the financial sector, money manager. Mm-hmm. Then I call somebody in Japan. How's the real estate market? He says, it's terrible. The rates are 3.5. He says, but I think if they put them down to 3, it's going to pick up. So I'm going like, all right, how important can rates be? It has to be other things that are important. We had 7% mortgages back in 2006 and 7. And we had like twice as many mortgages as we had 10 years later when mortgages were 3.5. And there's just other things. In the late 70s, everybody in my generation, their first mortgage was 15%, 17%. And, and that's, I remember when I got my first house, mortgages were higher. I hope it doesn't happen again. But if you look at the housing starts and the mortgages back then, it was higher than it is today. On a per capita basis, it was much higher. Okay, and because there's other things that drive these markets, and the rates are not that powerful. Now they make headlines and they're talked about, but you go back, we peaked at 2.6 million housing starts, I think. My first year, I worked at a small savings bank. That was 1973. It was 1972, we peaked at 2.6 million. Mortgage rates were 8%.
But
okay, and we only had 200 million people. We have twice as many people today, half as many mortgages. The rates are half, But it's like, okay.
But Warren, isn't there I read some literature on this. If you say to a commenter, QE doesn't seem to have such a big of an impact on at least inflation and perhaps on asset prices. Well, there I've definitely read research, especially for the first proposition, that it's very difficult to find. But I do think there is a lot of research stating that interest rate changes can have a very high impact on asset prices. Right?
Yeah, they'll affect it, sure, because asset prices are interest rates. A bond price is the interest rate, but so what? Does a bond price change? If you buy a 4% bond and then it drops in value, you still get your 4%, that you contracted for. If you're a pension fund, you still have 4% to pay your employees.
Sure, but house prices, it matters a lot, right? If you change the interest rate, now, for example, they're going up. A lot of my peers are having more difficulty buying a house now than I did when I bought at 1%.
Yeah.
So that's a big impact, right?
I don't disagree, but if you look at housing prices from 1960 to today, they pretty much just go up all the time. And if you look at the big inflation and the high rates of the late 70s, they kind of flattened out a little bit and then went right back up. You didn't see like a drop down or reversion to the mean or anything like that. They just keep going up, with inflation, no matter what the rates do. Because the rates are taking away from the borrower, but the saver's making money. And the parents, I'll just talk anecdotally as long as you are. The parents give the kids the money for the down payment, or they get more money at work because they need to work and they have to live somewhere. So the boss has to pay you enough to make your interest payment, or you can't have any employees, right? And the selling prices are high enough because people with money will pay it so that he can pay you enough to afford a mortgage. And you'll get a few months of dislocations. It doesn't usually amount to much more than that from the interest rates. So now I look at this last cycle, which is 6 months now, they've been raising rates fairly dramatically.
Yeah.
And it's supposed to slow down credit and borrowing. And you look at real estate loans in the banking system, they're going straight up. Consumer loans are going up. And people say, people are forced to borrow instead of pay cash. Okay, you can make up all these stories, but it sure hasn't slowed down the credit expansion. And it sure hasn't slowed down GDP. We had 2 negative quarters based on inventory adjustment from wildly overbuilding inventory from COVID. Now, once that's been adjusted, it's back up, and Fed St. Louis GDP now is back up to 2.8% with the rates going. And Biden said yesterday, President Biden, the U.S. economy is strong. Yeah, it is. The Fed's paying out, 3% of GDP, the equivalent. Not now, but it's approaching 3%. It will go to 3% of GDP. New deficit spending on interest. I'm saying it doesn't look like that has no effect. It looks like that's a huge amount of money and it's having an effect, and it's regressive. I don't like it, but it's the reality is that's, we took a regressive economy and made it twice as regressive by raising rates and supporting it from the top down. We've doubled down on trickle down, and trickle down works to some degree. It's I don't like it. I think it's like obscene, but it works to improve the numbers, whatever that means. And, GDP numbers, and that's what's going on. And it makes it tougher and tougher to fight it, when people kind of manipulate the data to show that it works.
So one thing that's definitely clear to me is that the way that you think about this, and perhaps by extension the way that this is thought about in MMT is a completely different lens to view things through.
Okay, well, than
economists typically do.
This is not even MMT. This is what every mainstream economist. This is what Paul Krugman told me when he was arguing with Stephanie Kelton in the.
Sure. No, but what I mean is more sort of this. So how I look at it is like, okay, and if we talk about interest rates going to the economy, we talk about different channels, right? Yeah. And a lot of the economists tend to focus on borrowing type of channels, and you tend to focus on the saving type of channel. I think a lot
look at the combination. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. But I think then sort of
think macro. Yeah.
Economists disagree then on which of, like, I think most economists would recognize that there are a lot of different channels, but then the disagreement comes on how big they are, right? And
let me give you an example.
Sure.
I was in a conversation with Paul Krugman. I haven't been in a long time, but a few years ago. I said, what's wrong with, you can run deficit spending to sustain full employment, job guarantee, whatever. And that's the economy's savings desire. And there's no limit to that. He says, well, yeah, because if you let that debt get too large, then the Fed can't raise rates to fight inflation because that interest will be causing inflation. And that was his argument against the job guarantee and against excessive deficit spending to sustain full employment in general. That was the argument. Okay. Now he's saying, these high rates the Fed's killing the economy. It's the same guy. Right? So you can't call it, I don't think you call it MMT or not MMT or mainstream or not in mainstream. It's the same guy. It's only been a couple of years. So, maybe the politics have just clouded their analysis. Maybe I've stripped away the politics to just look at the numbers. And if you don't like them, sorry. And these guys don't like them, then they don't see them.
All right, Warren, this provides me with the ultimate bridge, basically, to this section I had planned in the middle, because I think the discussion we've now sort of entered, like talking about interest rates, about the differences between the simple university type of money and the real world, it gets complicated. So maybe to sort of let everyone process that a little bit, I thought, right in the middle, let's play a little bit of a game, which I call myth, MMT or myth. So, because a lot of people have lots of opinions about MMT and they'd like to tweet about it. And so I was, I always get these questions. Is this true about MMT or not? I don't know. Let's ask Warren. So I have a slide here so everybody can see it, but I will read it to you. I have an article from Paul Krugman. So this is the little bridge. And he says in the New York Times, fairly well-known newspaper, deficits and printing press, somewhat wonkish. Right now, deficits don't matter. A point borne out by all the evidence, but there's a school of thought, the modern monetary theory people, who say that deficits never matter as long as you have your own currency. Is that MMT or myth?
Okay, so first it needs a little context. For solvency purposes, they never matter. The government checks will never bounce. The government can always spend another dollar or if it wants to.
Yes.
Second of all, at any given point in time, the deficit is residual, and that equals the real savings desires of the economy. Now, if it gets large by paying interest that nobody really wants, then you will get adjustments in the price level so that the government will wind up paying higher prices, and that will I'm trying to tie it back to your question. So the deficit per se doesn't matter ever. It doesn't create a condition where the government checks will bounce or they're going to cause inflation. It's a residual. The government check deficit always reflects the residual savings desire in the economy at that price level. By definition, it's a market-determined thing by definition. So that's mainstream. That's not necessarily MMT. That's mainstream. So he's contradicting his own mainstream analysis, and he's also contradicting my analysis, which I guess you could call MMT. But that's through any lens. There is no lens that doesn't give you that if you look at it close enough.
Right. Okay. Now I'm confused, Warren, because is it MMT or not MMT? You said in two sentences that it isn't.
It's MMT, but it's not exclusively MMT.
Right. Okay. So, but
it's
no,
MMT and mainstream.
But a new Keynesian would never say that government deficits never matter.
I wouldn't say that either but I would say for solvency purposes, they never matter.
But that's not what that he's.
Nobody says deficits never matter. Just by itself, there's always a context. Mm-hmm. Maybe they matter because you're going to lose the election. Matter for what? Okay, but that's what he does. And that's what the MMT critics do.
So you say he's too vague here. You should specify.
Deliberately vague. Deliberately vague. How about maliciously vague?
Okay.
It's a political technique.
All right. Okay. So we're
I can do that too, but I don't.
No.
It's intellectually dishonest. It's an intellectually dishonest statement.
All right. So it's a myth, right? Okay. I know we can get into sort of all the nuances around this.
That's like, look, are you still a communist? That's I don't know what you call those kinds of questions, but they're...
Yeah, but I mean, in all honesty, I think you do sometimes make it a bit tricky for people to see through that, because you actually engage with it fairly seriously. And first saying in some way, not completely, but that indeed deficits never matter. I mean, you don't exactly say that, but you can understand how people can interpret it like that, right?
If I don't qualify it, then I should have, or I didn't have time, or I made a mistake or something. But I'm pretty sure I qualify statements like that. I don't make statements like that are unqualified, because that's what I'm arguing against, all these unqualified statements.
Yeah, you're right. So what I meant is more like, even though what you just said, I think people at first can interpret that as, indeed, Paul Krugman says that, and now Warren repeats it. But then you give some nuances, but they're very, very nuanced. Anyway, let's stick with myth.
Yeah,
I have another one for you. Modern monetary. This is from a Twitter user called Demetri Kofinas. Modern monetary theorists will tell you that solving inflation is easy. All we need to do is raise taxes. Imagine trying to pass tax increases in this political environment. Crazy. The fact that smart people pretend this makes any sense remains an unsolved mystery. This is MMT or a myth?
It's a myth. It's a straw man argument. And so is Paul Krugman's argument a little bit of a straw man argument. They set something up and say it's MMT, and then they criticize it. So it's a myth. I mean, MMT doesn't... No MMT proponent I've ever known says that. Has ever said that.
I haven't heard, we haven't discussed it in your example, right? You have never said raising taxes reduces inflation.
No, I say raising taxes reduces aggregate demand. So in the case that you've got inflation because of excess aggregate demand, one of your options to reduce demand is to increase taxes. But I also add that I've been watching inflations for a long time now. I'm 73 years old, and I've yet to, it's possible, but I've yet to see one of them caused by aggregate demand. I just haven't seen it. I'm not saying it's not possible, and maybe I've missed, you pointed out, but I just haven't seen it. So that's the rarest kind of inflation that I've seen personally.
And then this brings me maybe then to sort of a very topical issue, inflation today, which is sky high, at least in where I am, Europe, and where you are, the United States. What type of inflation is this? This is not an aggregate demand inflation, is it?
Well, look, the word inflation has become a generalized term that doesn't tell you much, except it becomes synonymous for prices are high. Prices went up and they're high.
Yeah.
It's not that they're going up next year. So right now I've got to pay this much for gasoline. I've got to pay this much for energy to heat my house. I've got to pay this much at the grocery store. So prices are high. And the real question people are asking is, why did prices go up? My incomes haven't gone up. What's going on here? Now, your first clue is that when prices go up without incomes going up proportionally, at least when I grew up and went to school, that wasn't inflation. That was a shift in relative value, a shift in terms of trade. Okay, these were, we had relative value stories versus inflation stories. Inflation is where everything goes up. The United States reprices from dollars to pennies. Everything goes up 100 times. What used to cost $1 now costs 100 pennies. We just had 100 times inflation. Okay, but your wages went up also. So we have a situation here where prices have gone up, particularly energy prices. And they went up for a couple of reasons. First of all, going back a few years, the first big impetus were the tariffs. The president decided that we needed to punish Canada because they weren't charging us enough for lumber. So we put a 17% tariff on lumber. So lumber prices go up. Oh, we've got inflation in lumber. What are we going to do about that? It's like, okay. We just, this was like a politically initiated policy because Canada wasn't charging us enough for lumber. Don't ever send these guys to go shopping for you, by the way. And then President Biden comes in and he decides they're still not charging us enough. So he raises it to 34%. He doubles the tariff. So now we've got lumber prices have gone up some more. And they're not going to come down because we've got these 34% tariffs. And it's like, okay, well, we have to raise rates. We have to do this. It's the Fed's job. Oh, the money supply's up. This was just tariffs. Okay, this is pretty simple. We just legislated higher prices. Gasoline taxes. We legislate higher prices, right? And then, so we had tariffs on, 300 different items. And the presidents love these things because they're bringing in dollars. Like the U.S. needs these dollars. And so it's a profit center for the U.S. to raise prices on the American consumer to bring in money. It's like, all right, that's what it is. It's a tax. But taxes count as, quote, inflation. They're higher prices. So we had that problem. Then we had the energy issue, which was, and I think the Fed gave that, and then we had the supply chain things from COVID, right?
But this
Plus
is
the tariffs.
Yeah, okay.
And I think the Fed gave that like 0.5% a year of CPI increases. But the big one came through oil prices, right? So oil prices had broken during COVID. They got down to $40 a barrel, negative on the Board of Trade. And then they went up to 120, tripling in the price of our basic energy. Natural gas went from, I don't know, 2 something to $9, right? Everything just shot up. In Europe, it's even worse.
Yeah, 600% at some point. That's some pretty insane increases in what I use here for houses. It has a massive impact for heating my house.
That used to be called a shift in relative value. Now you have to work more to earn the same temperature in your house.
But wouldn't it be called a shift in relative value if other prices went down to compensate for this? And I think this is also something some economists will say. Like, but if it was only cost push or from the cost side, then if we had stable amount of money following monetarism, then prices would go down elsewhere. That's a shift of value to many people, I would say.
Yeah, and that didn't happen. Okay. We could have had wages go down, I suppose, but to get our cost of production down, it would have been even worse, right? So that doesn't happen because we've got our institutional structure is not such that wages are going to go down. It doesn't work in that direction. So other things go up. So you can call it inflation, call it whatever you want, but it's not like a monetary thing. So the answer to it is not to let's cut everybody's wages in half so the prices will come down in half. Like, what's the point, right? Yeah. So to get back to the
to where inflation is coming from
about the
now.
Energy prices. The other thing about the energy prices is they feed into everything. It's fertilizer to grow food. It's tractors for energy. It's transportation.
If energy prices now, gas prices going up here, or natural gas, I should say, to avoid confusion with the English language. Natural gas prices going up in Europe means that a lot of cafes or bars will raise the prices for coffee because they cannot pay their bill anymore. Yeah.
Right. And the price goes up if people don't shop there because they can't afford it. They go out of business. That's all. It's not like a market working. And the price of oil is legislated by Saudi Arabia. Saudi Aramco sets their OSPs. They set the price of oil. There's no others, just like what the government, the terms of exchange the government sets for its currency, set the information there. At the margin, the Saudis have a monopoly on oil. We either have to, at the end of the day, we have to buy their 7.5 million barrels a day or shut the lights off for 6 hours, 4 hours or something. And so they're a price setter, whether anybody recognizes it or not. And they thinly disguise it by setting spreads instead of absolute prices, but it comes out to the same thing. And again, I'm not going to be partially criticizing one president over another, believe me. I don't. They're all involved. They're all complicit. But President Trump was on record with the Republicans of having, when the price of oil broke, demanding that the Saudis cut production to get the price up because our oil industry was losing money. And Congress had put a resolution through the Republicans to stop sending weapons to Saudi Arabia, cut off relations if they didn't cut production to get the price of oil up so that our oil industry could survive. First of all, we didn't need them to do that. We could have done it without that happening. Instead of them raising the prices, cutting production, and us paying more, we could have just given the oil companies money. It would have been a lot cheaper. But I don't want to get into that argument. It didn't happen because let's just talk about what actually happened.
Yeah.
And the Saudis were infuriated that our government would start making demands on them to do this. And they got together with the Russians and became OPEC Plus, and they each cut by, 5 million barrels a day or something like that. Got price up, and it's been going up ever since. And now they're buddies, and we're up against them.
So, Warren, so inflation now is the consequence of the government. The government did it, but Russian government, Saudi government, and the US government started with tariffs. Can I summarize your argument like that, or is that?
Yeah. And there was some, there were COVID issues for sure, but those were all transitory. They've reversed. All the shipping's come back to where it was. But these other things were the problematic ones. If we had gotten 3 or 4% because of the COVID thing, nobody would have cared. But we're up at 8 or 9, and it's scaring people because their theory says so. If it gets too high, it runs away. It's not going to just, it doesn't like mean revert or anything. That's what their theories say. It just runs away because they've got all these misconceptions of how it propagates, right? And we turn it to Venezuela, we turn it to Argentina if we don't get it now. And that's has nothing to do with what happened. Or we turn Weimar, even worse. It's got nothing to do with what happened in those places. Okay, so we've got that fear, that mythology in our heads. Now you're talking myth.
Yeah. But so I can relate this back, maybe even to the transitory versus permanent inflation discussion. I don't know. Were you a year ago or something in the camp? Oh, this is going to be actually permanent because governments like Saudi Arabia and Russia are going to push this. Or
okay, I've been in a camp, and I was there in my 2010 when I wrote the book. Because back in 2008, the cycle didn't break until oil got up to like 150. The Saudis just started raising the price until it broke the economy. Now, there were vulnerabilities. I'm not arguing that, but that was the catalyst that took it down. And, I was thinking, here they are doing it again. Got up to about 120. And that if it keeps going, then the inflation keeps going. If it stops, goes down, stabilizes, and the inflation's over. It's entirely a function of energy prices, okay, with a little bit of a lag. So apparently Biden made some kind of a deal with President Biden with the Saudis back in July. He was going to strategic reserve, but the only way the price came down is they agreed to discount their official selling prices under the table to drive prices down into the election. Okay, and then something happened a couple of weeks ago where they had a huge falling out and policy stopped. But anyway, once oil stopped going up and started coming down, you could see the CPI numbers in the US just went sideways. We were heading back towards zero inflation, 0.3 or something like that. We're back to pre-COVID numbers. And if oil stays here, then I think we're going sideways and we're back. And it's been transitory only in the sense that oil went up, pushed everything up, comes down a little bit and levels off. Everything comes down a little bit and levels off. If you look at lumber prices, they get up to 1,600, and now they're back to 500. Well, they were 300 or 400 before, but they're up a little, but they're not, that's tariffs and everything else. But that big burst is over. All those commodity bursts have been reversed for the most part. And we're back to pre-COVID levels of price stability, except unless oil and gas start going up again. And I think they will. I don't know that they will. If they don't, then I won't expect the inflation to come back.
Right. So, but okay.
Except the higher rates are driving inflation. It won't come back to where it was until after we lower the rates. It'll stay. These rates will support inflation at higher levels than we would have had otherwise.
So okay, I like this because now at least we're getting back to sort of.
But is that MMT? MMT isn't that oil prices cause inflation. That's everybody. I hope so. I think that's everybody.
I think almost everybody agrees that oil prices have played a big role in inflation in most countries, like even monetarists, I would guess. Yeah, but okay, that's because then I think we again get back to even where I'm not fully convinced yet, but I do think it's a very valid argument in the sense that we get back to this interest rate debate. Like, does it cause inflation or does it reduce inflation? Well, that really depends on, is the borrowing effect, less borrowing, stronger than sort of more money through the government paying more interest rates effect?
But will the borrowing effect be overwhelmed by $1 trillion a year of interest payments, deficit spent by the government? It's a big number. Just, I can't say for sure it will, but I just say, look at the data. Everything's going up again. Yeah. We bottomed out second quarter and it's going up. And that was before the rate hikes. Since the rate hikes, everything's going up.
But this gives me an opportunity to move to the last subject that I want to discuss with you here, because our economies are also partially quite complex in the sense that we live in an international world. And I know you have made reference to sort of your university example also, living in an open economy, so I'm sure we'll get to that. Yeah. But we have, and MMT discussions tend to be held in a very US-centered sort of way, which does issue the reserve currency at the moment globally.
Yeah, but I think that's just empty rhetoric also.
Okay, so that's interesting. So I didn't necessarily say too much about it yet, but perhaps people would say MMT only works in the US because they have the reserve currency. Is that what your sort of is empty rhetoric, or is it broader?
Yeah, that's not.
Yeah. Okay.
That's not applicable. That's not a valid statement. I don't think.
So that's not the argument I wanted to make, but
any credence. Yeah.
But one thing that I did notice is that you said in one of your papers, or made reference to, like, okay, maybe sort of more mainstream economics can work in a gold standard world, right? But if we have floating currencies,
well, it depends on how you define
MMT
work.
always applies.
Well, it depends how you define it can work. It can't sustain full employment. And if you want to optimize your prosperity, your real wealth, you have to have full employment, because your real wealth is everything you produce domestically, plus your imports minus your exports. That's as old as economics goes. I mean, it's hundreds of years old. And there's no refuting. There's no refuting that. And so, if you're less than full employment, you're losing your real wealth. So why would you want to pursue that?
So if I can translate that, and this is true, right? I think nobody can deny that no current economic systems have sustained full employment. That's never been the case. So unemployment is the norm, sadly.
And you could say the losses from unemployment in 1 year, probably just the United States, just Europe, are larger than the real losses from all the wars in the history of the world put together.
That's interesting, yeah.
Given today's productivity.
Yeah, and given that this happens all the time, and wars and everywhere to the whole population, and wars only happen in specified some places, and okay. I mean, this is definitely a problem that I also have struggled with, especially when I briefly lived in South Africa, where unemployment rate is sky high, is 25 higher percent, which is
staggering loss of
because people are just sitting around, right? They're doing nothing. That's a real shame. That's indeed, and this is, I think, what you refer to as a loss of real wealth, because they don't do anything. They're idle.
Yeah. It's a loss of real wealth, and a loss of humanity and everything else. I mean, it's a lose situation.
But one thing that I could imagine, if I were to start a currency now in a new country where I'm dependent on perhaps imports, I might need to charge interest rates, because I want to anchor my currency to another currency.
Yeah, see now,
but that's maybe the gold standard type of world again. Where
when I decompose all that, it doesn't make any sense to me at all. We can go through it bit by bit, but that's just.
So I could imagine, like, if I want to start a small island nation next to Europe, for example, I want to start out by anchoring my currency to the euro, because
why didn't the UMKC anchor their currency to the dollar?
Sure. I mean, let's make it easier then, right?
Like, in fact, they talked about it, but we said, like, why would you do that? Nobody could come up with a reason to do it.
Because it makes trade easier to Europe or to US in this case.
I don't think so. I mean, I've said to somebody, like, I used to give these talks in Italy, and they said, well, what if you go to full employment and Italy can't buy oil? It's like, show me one country in the world ever that can't buy oil. And a friend of mine, Marshall goes, Sub-Saharan Africa or something.
Sri Lanka cannot buy oil at the moment, right?
Well, if you Google, they had a different kind of problem because they had all the importing organized by the state. But I'll bet right now, if you Google Sri Lanka petrol station, gasoline station, you'll see a station with people filling up their cars with a price in local currency up there.
Yeah, but they cannot buy enough oil. I think that's pretty.
You got to fill your car up, and they won't. The pump shuts off. I mean, I don't think so.
I mean, why are they queuing then?
Price might be too high. Are they still queuing? I don't know.
I'm not sure if they still are, but they were for a long time, for sure.
I assume if they were still queuing, I would have seen it. But you can look it up. But if you and they had they had the fixed exchange rate, just like you said, and it blew up. But under plenty of countries operating without fixed exchange rates, weak currencies, impoverished countries, there's stations where you can buy it. Now, most people can't afford it, but the oil companies will sell it based on going exchange rates, whatever they are. Okay, and it turned out I was with an economist named Brancaccio or something in Rome, telling me, well, in 1973 you couldn't buy oil during the crisis in Italy. And then I wasn't there. I said, I don't know. And somebody else told me, no. What happened was in 1973, the government did not want you to buy oil because they didn't want you filling up your car. And so they were trying to discourage people from doing it. It wasn't that the oil companies wouldn't sell it, that the government didn't want you to. It was the opposite. They were tripping over themselves trying to find ways to deliver it when the government said no. So, and if you look at any country in the world, and you look at the global south, you say, what's your macro problem? And they say, oh, too many imports, or imports exceed export.
Yeah.
Okay, that's the problem is too many imports. Have you ever seen one country where the problem was we can't import? I've just never seen it. I mean, I like to look at.
Well, I mean, Afghanistan at the moment cannot buy its crucial imports. Lebanon cannot buy enough food imports, right?
So, what does that mean? Because people can't afford it at the going prices of local currency?
Yeah, at the going exchange rate. And that's why the exchange rate is collapsing.
Right. Okay. And so if you look at the total, but then you say that's why the exchange rate is what it is. And it's collapsing for other reasons. And I don't know what their interest rate is, but I was just in Argentina, and the problem there was, they were paying 50% interest on their peso debt. Mm-hmm. And because their inflation rate was 40 and they had to keep a real rate. But the interest goes to people who already have money and they don't want any more pesos. So they just sell it for foreign exchange. So the exchange rate goes down, like you're talking about, which causes imported prices to go up. So inflation rate goes to 50. So the government pays 60. So now that people are getting 60% in pesos, it's like 10% of GDP in peso interest. Selling it caused the exchange rate to go down. And they're in this spiral. They just went 80% inflation and 90% interest rate. It's like no end to this. Because the interest payments are being fed into the foreign exchange markets and pushing down the exchange rate, pushing up imported prices, which pushes up the inflation rate, which pushes up interest rates. It's just the horrible cycle they're in, and they keep doing it. Now, maybe the same thing's happening in Lebanon. I don't know. I don't follow every country in the world, but if you look it up, more often than not, there's something like that going on. It's just insidious, and it's at the expense of all these people who can't get enough to eat. It's got nothing to do with operating, with a fixed versus floating exchange rate.
Well, I mean, so one thing I wonder about the whole fixed versus floating exchange rate debate that there is in broader economic circles, because also I think in more mainstream circles there was the idea floating exchange rates solves most of the macroeconomic problems. I think even someone like Milton Friedman was in favor of it. Yeah. But there I wonder, how floating are exchange rates actually, in the sense that if there are small movements, it's totally fine, and I think it works really well. Also, euro is considered to be freely floating. But I think what, for example, you can see in Turkey is that if the moves are too fast, then it does become an issue because imports do get way too expensive. And so, in effect, how floating is it really? Does that make sense?
Well, what's interesting, they are. I mean, you look at Japan, it's down 30 or 40%, right, recently. Yeah. Europe dropped by the same amount. The dollar's dropped by that amount before. The Australian dollar went from 105 to 60 or something. All these currencies move a lot. It's not, they don't all abandon them for the gold standard. They all move, and it doesn't have all these horrible effects. In fact, you can't get politicians to agree on whether they want their currency to go up or down. The Chinese currency goes down, everybody starts yelling at them for unfair trade. It's like, right? You went in with into this agreement with too strong an exchange rate. Now the trade's not fair. So it's even ambiguous within the political debate whether they want the currency to go up or down. They don't even have that. They don't even have that sorted out.
Yeah, but it might depend on the situation, right? Okay. In some cases, you want it to go up. Like now, for example, now there's high inflation everywhere, so you don't want your currency to go down too much. Like if I'm running Europe,
What's the inflation? What's the inflation rate in Japan?
Well, I think it has been going up since the yen has gone down a lot. Well, they want that, right? They don't mind.
Well, that's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying. It's like, I mean, I have opinions on where it should be, but I'm just talking about the political class doesn't have a clue. They talk out of both sides of their mouth from one day to the next on this stuff.
Yeah, but they
contradict themselves in the same sentence.
Yeah, but you can. Okay, fair enough. I'm not going to defend the political class, but
that'd be too easy for me.
But I will say, as a European, I liked the exchange rate going down a little bit, especially as someone who operates on YouTube and thus has a dollar income. Okay, I'm like an exporter of services in that way. Yep. So I like that. Yep. But now I don't like too much that the euro is not collapsing, but going down so quickly. Because it adds to a lot of inflation, since Europe imports a lot of stuff that I typically do like to buy from places like Asia. And you do see that, I think, in increased prices and all of that.
Yeah. So it's going down because, of course, the high prices you're paying for prices that are being dictated by
Russia.
And
right.
Saudi Arabia. And, those euros are being spent to people who don't particularly want them. And and it's raising the cost of all your production. So your exports aren't as competitive. And, your trade balance just reversed, right? From plus 300
yes, in Europe, yes. We used to be current account surplus region long time. Now deficit, yes.
Right. So and Japan had the same kind of reversal. All the energy users had reversals. The U.S. has the lowest domestic prices of energy, so our exports are going up, which is helping the dollar. And a lot of what you're looking at is strong dollar versus weak euro too. So when there's things going on in the strong currencies that have been helping them, and we can get in a currency discussion for 10 hours here, so probably not a good idea. But did you have any more myth versus MMT?
I do, yes. Let's. But actually, I think that this would also be a good point to ask some more audience questions, right? I think I've seen a lot of them come by. So let me see. I did also get a question about Norway. So the question was from a channel called Political Economy. And I believe it was about Norway's foreign wealth fund. So very wealthy through gas exports, right? So the question there was, does that help the Norwegian government's budget? Does it help the Norwegian government to spend more?
What happened was your real terms of trade improved dramatically with the North Sea oil, right? And so you're allowed, gives you the benefit of being able to, you're exporting oil, so you can import all kinds of other things with the proceeds. And so it's just a big increase in wealth, real wealth for Norway through its real terms of trade. Now, and the exports, of course, were the cost. You could have kept the oil for yourselves, but you sold it and got dollars and put it in a fund, and now you can use those to buy imports. And that's your deferred compensation, you might say, for the oil you sold in previous years. And I guess you're still selling oil today, right? Are you a net exporter still? I don't know. I don't even know.
Norway.
I mean, you're not Norwegian.
I'm not Norwegian.
But from the point of view of the question.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, Norway is a net gas exporter, so they are running the biggest current account surplus. They're maybe the only country in Europe still running a current account.
So that allows more imports, and so your terms of trade just improved by the price differentials. Gas prices going up.
All right,
it's a huge. Yeah.
I have another question from Buck Franks, who asks, why wasn't inflation coming down on its own during the Volcker era, and they had to enact harsh hikes?
Okay, the inflation came down when the oil price broke. And it went from like 40 to 10 or something over a couple of years, but it broke to 30-ish and 20, and it started coming down.
And was that after the rate hikes or before it?
That was after the rate hikes, but after the recession that was caused not by the rate hikes. I mean, I was there, but I didn't see it caused by it, but by the fiscal tightening. And the fiscal balance tightened because of the inflation that the rate hikes helped perpetuate. So, for example, we had inflation, I don't remember the exact numbers, like 12%, and we were running a budget deficit of 6%. Well, in real terms, that means the public debt is dropping by 6%. So that's like running a budget surplus of 6%. And it just got too low to support the credit structure, which was growing because of the inflation. Prices are up. You have to borrow more for working capital and run your business and just for what you call the general money supply. And the whole thing collapsed because of overly tight fiscal policy, which looked loose on the surface with a 6% deficit, but beneath the surface, it was a 6% surplus because of the 12% increase in prices. And it caused a horrible cave-in, and nobody quite understood what it was. They blamed the interest rates on that. The interest rates were actually contributing to the 6% deficit. They were contributing to prices going up, which then caused the real public debt to fall. So in that sense, indirectly, the interest rates caused the public debt to fall because of the inflationary impact. And that's what caused that big crash. And that brought the demand for oil went way down in the recession, and that's what turned it around. At the same time, in 1978, President Carter had deregulated natural gas. And it had all been capped because the price you could charge was only 50 cents when it was worth $2.50 or something. And once he deregulated it, then they could start producing it again. And the utilities felt comfortable switching from oil to natural gas. And that whole transition started and kind of opened the door to that happening and kept the demand for oil low over the next 10 years or so. relative to what it had been as utilities converted and other places converted, businesses converted to natural gas from oil. So we had that going on. But if you look at what happened to the price of oil, and it went from like $3 to $40. It's like 12 times or something, 13 times in 10 years. So that's like today going from 80 to 1,000, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think Europeans can totally understand this now a little bit.
And that's what happened,
our
right.
net gas prices did.
But then when it comes down, you'll see the inflation numbers coming down. Back then, they came down very slowly because the high interest rates were keeping them up. It was supporting demand. It was supporting forward prices. It was supporting all kinds of things. And so the inflation came down, but slowly, and they kept a real rate and brought it down. It took 10 years to get down to 3%, even with oil going from 40 to 10. So that's because the inflationary forces from the monetary policy, the interest rates, were propping things up more than they would have been otherwise. That's the way I saw it.
I think this is very interesting in the sense that I hope also for everybody watching that this gives you a different way to think about this. And this is also something that I don't always agree with it, but I completely see that it's logical. And if I would not agree with it, would only be because I would say, well, I think the borrowing channel is in many cases stronger than the savings channel. Yeah. Or perhaps I would say, well, but I think rates aren't actually that flexible in practice, right? If we talk about the international case, but that's fair, right? That's how economists debate.
And I'll agree with you. I'll agree with you. The borrowing thing can be there in the short term. 2 or 3 months, people get scared and don't buy houses. And what the Fed says is that moves things forward, pushes things backwards. And so the interest rate changes can move things back or forward in time is the way they say it. And that's true of a lot of individual items. But so far, we've seen GDP accelerate after the hikes. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah, and we haven't seen inflation come down, I think.
We've seen the credit aggregates accelerate. We haven't seen the core inflation come down. We've seen headline come down with oil, but not core.
Interesting.
So we'll see.
Yeah. So one thing, because I also had one question before about sort of trade deficits, and apparently someone told me that you got into a debate with Steve Keen over trade deficits. Do they matter or not? And that piqued my interest because I currently would hold the position that I understand why many developing nations want to have a trade surplus. I think it has been demonstrated by Russia and in the other way around by Sri Lanka and Lebanon, how handy it can be to have a trade surplus because it gives you a source of foreign currency when other sources get shut down. And the other way around by Sri Lanka and Lebanon, where they had too much of a trade deficit in very crucial sectors that they just couldn't replace immediately. So I would say it matters. I understand why it matters a lot. Would you agree with that?
Well, if you're going to use it to generate money to buy imports, then it's not a trade surplus. It's balanced.
But they didn't do that.
We're talking about using it just to build up
reserves,
financial assets.
Yeah, exactly. As a war chest, which is very useful in a financial crisis, or if there's a run on your currency, or if you get in an economic war, as we saw with Russia.
But let's do that one at a time.
Yeah.
So for Russia, it wasn't useful at all because their dollar deposits were all frozen. So they can't even spend the money.
Yes, but how are they keeping the ruble up now? Because they still have that currency.
Because they don't import anything. They're not allowed to import. So they have no imports. Mm-hmm. So if you're not allowed to import, your currency goes up. Right? That's pretty obvious. So
I'm not sure if I would agree that they're not allowed. I mean, I know that we wouldn't want them to import much.
That's what the sanctions are. That's what the sanctions are.
Yeah, but they're very leaky, right? They're not really working.
But they're not
like that.
Yeah, but they're strong enough to keep their currency up.
So you wouldn't see a role for the capital controls that they put in place there, because I would argue that also played a big role.
Which ones are those?
So Russia. So restricting foreigners from fleeing, taking their money out of the country.
Taking rubles out?
Or dollars. I don't think it matters.
Well, they can't. The dollars aren't there anyway. They can't. The dollars are credits on Western banks.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, so let's say take rubles out, because then rubles can't be sold on the international market anymore.
Okay, but who is doing that anyway? I mean, they didn't have a problem with rubles leaving the country.
Didn't they?
They had a problem internally with people selling rubles to buy dollars, but now they're not allowed to buy dollars. The whole thing is they're cut out of the dollar market, so they can't sell rubles to buy dollars anymore. They're not allowed to. I'm not saying there aren't leakages through crypto or something, but it's not like it was.
Yeah, but that's what I meant, right? So you can't sell your rubles anymore for dollars.
Right, which means they can't import.
Yeah, but it also means they can't just sell that. You can also sell for financial assets, right? You don't have to import a good or service.
Yeah. Well, what I'm saying is the trade balance that shifted dramatically over there, where they stopped importing and continued exporting, and that's where the and suddenly people who want to buy Russian oil, let's say, they're no longer selling products in Russia and getting rubles that they can use to buy the oil. They have to get the rubles now because that's what Russia said. But they're only like buying things. They're only buying things from Russia. So there's no pressure on the ruble. It just takes it all away. If any country stopped importing like that, then your trade goes into surplus. Your currency gets stronger. The same way the opposite happened with Europe, where you have to spend more for energy and the currency gets weaker. Yeah. Your imports went way up. So your import bill went way up, not the volume, but your import expense went way up. Russia, their import expense went to zero. In Europe, it went way up. In Japan, it went way up.
So I'm not sure if Russia's import expense went to zero, but
I'm exaggerating a little bit, but it went way down because they can't buy anything. They're not allowed to buy anything.
Sure,
they're being sanctioned. They're being cut off. They can't get parts for their weapons. They can't get parts for anything. They're not allowed to buy things.
All right. So okay. We may disagree on sort of how much Russia is still actually importing, but to make that into a fruitful discussion, we have
but it's
to
way
get
down.
into
Let's
the
just
data.
say it's way down. Let's just say it's way down. Yeah.
But and then finally, and then I think we're going to round off slowly. How about Sri Lanka and Lebanon, which could be coincidental, big current account deficit countries, and they were specifically dependent on crucial imports such as energy and food. Is that a problem?
Yes.
But I mean, the Russian one, I'll just give
Russian imports dropped from 30.76 to 24 as of January. So they've dropped more since. So they're way down.
They're certainly down, yeah, sure.
Way down, yeah. Okay. So next.
So just Sri Lanka and Lebanon. Current account deficit countries.
I don't know what happened in Lebanon. I know Sri Lanka had a fixed exchange rate that blew up because they were borrowing money to support the currency, it's what I've seen, a totally unsustainable process. It runs out when you can't do that anymore. Nobody will lend you the money to do it. Then it's over. And that's what happened.
All right. Fair enough. Warren, shall we leave it at that? I think we had I really enjoyed the discussion. I hope it has been a productive discussion for you as well. I think we went through most of it, right? I think we went through the basics with the how you start with taxing, then you can issue money. The taxing gives that money value. Then
you can spend it. That allows you to spend it.
All right, exactly. Yeah, fair enough.
Right.
And then there's possibly a job guarantee to anchor the value of your currency. But you can do it in another way as well. And then I think I use the job guarantee as the base case for purposes of analysis, with the idea that if you want to use something else, fine, you make the shift. But you have to start with something. There is you can't just have nothing. And so that's my starting point. It's not a policy proposal per se; it's a starting point. And for lack of anything better, I guess it's a policy proposal. But if you got a better one, fine. It's not a. Yeah, and you mentioned you could also use gold, even though you would not necessarily think it's the best, but you could do it.
Yeah, but you can't sustain full employment with gold, so you're going to not have you're not optimizing your standard of living or anything else.
And that's actually interesting. I think like that. Full employment is sort of what you have in mind as the best outcome, right?
So I think it's politically has advantages, and what I start with is the idea that you want to have maximum. How do you optimize your prosperity, your output? And the first thing you do is you got to have everybody working to get maximum output. Anybody not working represents lost output. So I did a paper called Exchange Rate Policy and Unemployment, and it goes into detail on how with a fixed exchange rate policy, you cannot necessarily sustain full employment at all times, but with floating rate exchange rate policy, you can always sustain full employment, which means you'll always be sustaining your real wealth at optimal levels, composition issues aside. And all the other things that might happen, as long as you're sustaining optimal output, they all become distributional issues and not issues fundamental to your well-being. So you're always optimizing your well-being with floating exchange rate, full employment policy.
All right. Yeah. But there is, I think, sort of, if I can recap our discussion, where we might still have some differences of opinion on which channel of interest rates stronger, and perhaps on how floating exchange rates really are. But
and on the interest rates, I say just look at the data. I understand the argument. I look at the data and I see that the payment now is dominating, but that can change, and just keep an eye on it.
Yeah, and I think it is definitely something I will dive into, and it's also something that I think sort of mainstream empirical researchers would not look into per se, because that's not what the theory typically talks about. But it would be interesting avenue of research if
they talked about it 2 years ago when they were arguing why we can't sustain full employment. Now they're not arguing it; they changed it. They dropped it. They were saying, the reason we can't sustain full employment with deficit spending is the deficit get too large. And then the interest payment, then the Fed won't be able to raise rates to fight inflation because the interest will cause inflation. That was their argument 2 years ago. Now they've dropped it.
Right?
Yeah. And on the others too. I was just interviewed by Peter Coyne at the New York Times, and he went to Michael Woodford, who's Professor Woodford's top guy.
Yeah.
And he said, well, if the interest becomes problematic like that, you can always raise taxes to offset it, which is exactly my point. And when they asked Krugman it's in the New York Times, do you agree with Woodford? He said, yes, I agree with Woodford. Of course, he wouldn't dare not agree with him because he's the guru. But it's not like it's part of the mainstream core model. It's not something I'm just making up that they can refute. It's their own core model.
All right. Well, I think then that's an amazing thing to close off with.
Good.
Warren.
All right.
Thanks so much for this. I really hope that it helped a lot of people. And goodbye, everybody. Hope this was enlightening to you, and I hope that you actually learned way more, such that the poll next time would be the other way around: 30% not necessarily knowing MMT yet, and 70% knowing it. Yes. So thanks so much. Cheers, everybody.